Today we're going to make over this horrible dated yellow finish using decoupage. Decoupage is a method of attaching papers to a piece of furniture using an adhesive and making them part of your finish. I knew that I wanted this piece to have a wood stain top, so I started by removing the yellow finish from the top of this piece of furniture. This one was a bear to remove. I used chemical stripper and it just was thick and sticky and would not scrape off. Once I had my top all stripped, my next steps were to remove my hardware and put those out to be cleaned, and then I covered my piece in a coat of Dixie Slick Stick because the existing finish on this was a slick yellow, almost glossy finish. Slick Stick is a gripping primer from Dixie Paint. It's going to give my finish something to bite onto. My next step is to go ahead and give this a coat of Dixie Paint in Rusty Nail. I chose Rusty Nail because it's a perfect background color for the paper that I plan to use on this. I felt like the front of this piece was fairly plain, so I went ahead and attached a Would You Bend molding, also from Dixie to the bottom apron of the front. Would You Bend moldings are moldings that bend when heat is applied to them. This is a flat front, so I just applied a little bit of Titebond Quick and Thick adhesive. I applied a little bit of heat to the front of it, and this helps it seat perfectly into the flat front of my piece. Here we are at the end of day 2. I've got a coat of Rusty Nail on my entire body, my Would You Bend molding is attached, and I'm ready to start attaching my paper to this piece. Okay, the next step on this dresser that we're going to do behind me is we're going to go ahead and add the decoupage paper. So I chose this paper. This is what my whole piece was inspired by. This is by Roycycled, and I laid on a base coat of my Rusty Nail. I chose Rusty Nail because it's similar to the colors that are in the paper. And when you get paper moist to decoupage with, it's going to make the paper a little bit translucent. So the color that you pick, you want to consider that you're going to be able to see through to underneath. Dark colors with light papers are usually not very friendly. Let me show you what supplies I got out to go ahead and do my decoupage with. So the first thing, the most important thing is I need my adhesive. So I like to use wallpaper paste. This is Roman brand wallpaper paste. I picked this up at Lowe's. It's fairly inexpensive. You can also use any of your Dixie clear coats as your decoupage medium. I'm not using those because they set up a little bit quicker, and this gives me a little bit more working time with the paper. So we're going to use my wallpaper paste. And then I've got out a brush, of course, to apply it. I've got out a brayer, and a brayer is a rolling pin tool. I have a few of these and I like each of them for a little bit different reason, so I just pick them up when I see them. This one's made of rubber, so it's nice and soft, but this is going to help me flatten out my paper and get those bubbles out when I lay it. I've got out a razor knife. You want to make sure this is nice and sharp because we're going to be cutting some paper. I got out a tape measure because I want to measure out the placement of the paper on my drawers, a rag, and then some paper towels. So those are all my supplies that I've got out. So the first thing I did is I laid out my paper. Now this is 2 sheets, a right and a left side, and they do seam together in the middle. And I want that seam to fall dead center of my piece. And so all I did there is I went ahead and took a tape measure and I measured dead center on my drawer, which falls right here. Let me talk to you a little bit about what my plan is as I'm laying this paper. I try to lay it out as a dry fit and make sure that I've got it rough idea where I want to put it before I start adding moisture to the paper. Once I add moisture to the paper, my play time gets limited. So what I'm looking at right here is I've got this crevice on my piece, this little piece of molding. And what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the edge of my paper by tucking it inside that crevice. And then I'm going to paint around the edges to make them match. That's what I'm thinking I'm going to do. And if I hold this up to where center is on my drawer, it makes it all the way across to the other side. So let me show you that here. So I know that my paper is going to be long enough. And then I know that I'm going to have to cut it off down here at the bottom. But I do plan to use this other piece on the bottom here to go ahead and wrap the sides of my furniture piece. So that gives me an idea what the layout on this is going to look like before I start cutting or laying it. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I've got my paper laid out here on the front of my drawer. I did go ahead and take my drawer down so it's a horizontal surface versus trying to work on it up in my dresser. It's just going to make it easier to work on. I'm going to come in here with my razor knife. I've got a straight edge here, and I'm just going to go ahead and cut my paper to the size of this drawer. I'm going to cut it ever so slightly larger, just fractions of an inch larger, so that I can make sure that I've got extra paper to work with. This is where that little ridge is in the piece, so I'm going to skip over that. And then come here and I'm going to cut it. I'm using those lines of the molding as a guide. And I'm just cutting it right to the edge of that molding. Make sure I get a nice straight line I do try to cut my paper a lot so that I'm working in smaller sheets versus trying to work in this one huge sheet, which is a lot. Okay, so let's go ahead and take this off, and this should be my first sheet here. I do need to cut it right where that ridge of that piece was, and then I can go ahead and start laying this. Okay, so from here I'm going to go ahead and attach my paper. So now that I've got my dry fit, I've got my piece cut, I'm going to come back and apply a little bit of my wallpaper paste. I'm only going to go from the center of the drawer, so where I marked my center, because that's where I know that I want this paper to line up to. And it only takes a fairly thin layer. You don't really need to gob this on. A little bit goes a long way. I'm going to go down into this crevice here, and I like to work small areas at a time. So if this was a big, huge drawer face, I would only apply the paste to a small portion of it at a time. So nice thin layer across all of my front, making sure I get down in that crevice where I want the edge of my paper to go. A nice, smooth, even coat. All right, and that gives me some moisture to go ahead and work with. Now I'm going to start applying my paper. I'm going to go ahead and fold it over so I'm only working with half of it. Once you start getting the paper wet, you really want to try to get it on there. I'm going to line it up to my center point on the drawer. Make sure I've got it evenly placed from top to bottom, and then I'm slowly going to work my way across this piece. I'm just going to use my hand. I will come back and use my brayer in just a minute. And we'll go down into this crevice right here. And I can see right away that moisture starts wrinkling my paper. So I want to make sure that I'm getting those out. So let's get in nice and close so you guys can see the wrinkles coming out of the paper. Okay, so I'm about as close as I can get while still working on this. And I'm just going to take my brayer and I'm going to roll these wrinkles out. I'm finding this one's not getting the contact that I want, and that's why I like to have multiple brayers. I kind of know what each one does better. This one's a little bit softer, although the roller does kind of fall off the handle sometimes, so I don't like this one for that reason, but I like the contact that it gets. Now the paper stretches a little bit when it's wet, so some of the wrinkling, the fine wrinkles, will work themselves out as my paper dries. And then I'm going to go ahead and let this fall all the way across the front of my piece. And now I'm going to go ahead and roll out the entire thing, make sure it gets nice contact with my wallpaper paste. Okay, and then I'm going to use my fingers and I'm just going to tuck the edge of my paper. Remember, I wanted it to fall right inside those crevices on my drawer. I'm just going to tuck the paper down inside of that molding. Just using my fingernail to press it down. My intent is to paint the edges so you can't see where this paper ends. That's my intent with this. All right, and let's go ahead and work some more of these wrinkles out. Pretty flat though. There's really not a whole lot in there. I've got one right here. I can get those out with my fingers. One right there. Get down in that crevice and then go across it right here. Now I may go ahead and just score my paper right down this line. Just give it a little cut. And that way I'm not trying to go up this ridge. With one sheet of paper, it's going to lay flat right here. I'm not even cutting all the way through it. I'm just giving it a little bit of a score in that crevice. Very lightly. That's why you want to have a nice sharp blade on your cutting tool when you're doing this. All right, and that laid nice and flat too. So I feel like this piece of paper is laid really nicely across the front of my piece. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is go ahead and cut my second sheet of paper. I'm going to line it up to my center point, and then I need to cut it over to this edge as well. So I'm just going to line that up, take my straight edge. I've got my razor knife here, again with a nice sharp blade on it, and I'm just going to cut right along the edge of my ruler. I'm using this crevice as my guide. I'm going to do the same thing here that we did on the other side, and I'm going to go ahead with my brush and I'm going to apply my wallpaper paste, a nice thin, even coat. Like I said, a little goes a long way. You'd want to make sure you don't have any, there's a little speck of dust or hair or something Any of those will show through because this is such a thin paper, so you want to make sure that your surface is nice and clean, and any little lumps or bumps that are on there, that you remove those before you start laying your paper down. I want to make sure I don't have a place in there where my paint is going to show through. And then I can start working this out. I'm going to just use my hand to start with because the paper is nice and dry. Once it becomes wet, it's more likely to tear. So then you want to kind of stop using your hand if you don't need to. I'm going to use my brayer, and I'm just going to roll this out slowly as I go. I'm going to roll it horizontally and vertically. I'm going to press this paper into the crevice. It's going to roll down this little molding right here. And then I'm going to come back and start working it across my next. All right, and I'm going to do that with my brayer. Okay, I do want to make sure that I am including this center bar. I don't want to have a gap in my pattern. So this does show on my piece. So I want to make sure I put my paper here, and then it's going to continue on to the next row below. I really love using decoupage finishes. It's a really cool way that you can add any variety of prints to the front of your piece. So think of any print that you can get on a piece of paper. You can really add that to a piece of furniture. In this case, I'm using a thin tissue paper, but this also works for posters. It works for photographs. It works for wallpaper. So there's any number of paper prints that you can put on your furniture piece. Even paper napkins work. I like this same technique no matter what the thickness of your paper. If my paper were a little bit thicker, the only difference I would make is I go ahead and back butter my paper as well. Once my paper is all laid, I let my wallpaper paste dry overnight, and then I'm going to come back and brush on a coat of Dixie clear coat over the top of my paper. This encapsulates it and makes my paper a permanent part of my furniture piece. Around the edges of my paper. So I just had a few areas where my paper didn't cover, and I want to camouflage those so you don't even notice that the paper isn't there. And so what I'm doing, if you want to look down here in this drawer here, these are all the colors that I see in this paper. So I've got collard greens, holy guacamole, palmetto, those are my greens. I've got rusty nail and apricot, kernel mustard, and midnight sky. I'm not really using the flamingo, so I'll go ahead and set that aside. So these 8 colors, and I'm doing them in between these 3 brushes. So I just chose 3 brushes, and the reason I did that is because I've got one that I'm using with my greens, I've got one that I'm using with my rust colors, and then one that's going in the yellow, and then the blue is kind of going on the green brush. So here's what I'm doing. I'm going to dip in, and I look at what's on the edge of my paper. So right here, I see that this would be a match to my collard greens. And so I'm just going to come right here, and I'm going to dab this. Now I'm going to layer some colors on top of this, but I want to go ahead and just get a bottom layer down, and then I can come in and stipple. Stipple is just when you use your brush in a dotting technique. So I'm just kind of stippling in a little bit over the base of my rusty nail. And it's okay if that peeks through, because that's the main background color on this paper. This is my brush with my apricot on it. So I'm going to fill that spot in, and let's go ahead and get a little spot of the apricot right here too. Now I'll let these dry for just a minute. In the meantime, I'll come around here. If you're filling it around a decoupage paper, it doesn't have to match exactly right. It just has to look convincing enough. So I've already done all the way along this bottom row here. And I feel like if you look at it, you cannot tell that that's painted in. This also helps camouflage the edge of my paper as well. So I'm going to go ahead and continue painting in around this. And I think once I'm done with the piece, you're not even going to be able to tell where the paper ends and the little spots that I've painted in around it. But those are my main tips: is look for what colors you see in the body color here. Try to dissect it. If you don't have every color in the Dixie line, you can pull them out in acrylic paints, small acrylic paints, and you can paint in around a paper. This also works around transfers too. If you have a transfer that's too small for the body of your piece, you can paint in around it and give it the image of looking larger than it actually is. For all of my wood surfaces, I used a wash of Dixie Belle Coffee Bean. Coffee Bean is a deep, rich brown, and I diluted it so that it attaches to the wood almost like using a wood stain. I did also end up painting the bottom apron of this piece to match the decoupage paper, and then I added my rusty nail paint to my drawer sides, some black hardware that was spray painted, and a little bit of gold gilding wax on my wood bend, and this piece is finished. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll click the subscribe button. You can find more Brush by Brandy on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube.